Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Christmas Grieving by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. New York City, 1865. At the age of 8, Molly Gray knew the importance of money, especially for those who had none. And they had none. When her parents had told her of a faraway land across the sea where they could be whomever they wanted to be, Molly didn't imagine them being dirt poor. Nor did she imagine living in a room with her parents in a tenement on the Lower East Side of the city known as New York. No, Molly had imagined never being hungry again. She had imagined pretty dresses and a beautiful home. She had imagined her mother combing her fiery hair with an expensive brush as her father looked on with nothing but love in his eyes. But that wasn't the reality of the New World. Many traveled from England across the vast sea to seek their fortunes, but Molly and her parents had come to find only more of all they had hoped to escape. She didn't see love shining in her father's eyes. On most days, all she saw in his gaze was the look of defeat, a look Molly had come to recognize in their poor neighborhood. On other days, there would be a brief flicker of hope when he returned home with money jingling in his pocket, but that hadn't happened for a long time. Molly squeezed her eyes shut as she tried to remember the last time she had seen that flicker of hope. Easter, she decided. Since it was Christmas Eve morning, that meant a very long time ago. She reached for the coat that fit way too tightly around her arms and wrapped a scarf around her neck, lifting her fiery red hair out from under the scarf. She took a seat on the edge of the bed and pulled on her boots. It wasn't really a bed, just a few crates stacked on top of one another with a thin mattress on top. Her parents slept in the bed on the other side of the room. Dressed and ready to face the snowy morning that awaited her outside, Molly walked to her mother's bed. "Mama, are you still sleeping?" Her mother groaned, but didn't move. Her father's side of the bed was already empty. The sooner he got to the docks in the mornings, the better the chances were of getting a day's paid work. Just because it was Christmas Eve didn't mean Molly or her father could stay home. They needed money, not for presents or a fancy meal, but to buy coal for heat. Her mother hadn't been feeling well for weeks now. Flu, her father had said, but Molly couldn't remember ever sleeping so much when she had the flu. She touched her mother's forehead, which was hot under her hand. "I'll be back soon, Mama." Molly fetched the basket that she had left by the door the day before and counted the number of ribbons she had left. She had 20 pieces of ribbon of different colors. She pinched her eyes shut tightly as she clasped her small hands around the basket. "God, please help me sell all the ribbons today. Then Father can stay home for Christmas." With her basket in hand, Molly stepped out into the blustering cold. The wind howled through the filthy streets as if wailing. Molly couldn't even blame the wind for wailing. Sometimes when she looked around the area where they lived, she felt the same. The snow, which had formed a beautiful white blanket early in December, was now nothing but a nuisance, creating sludge, mud, and a terrible mess. Carefully, she kept to the sidewalk, cautious not to slip as she carried her basket into the nicer part of town. The part of town where people could afford to buy ribbons. The part of town where girls cared how they decorated their hair because they didn't have to care about having clothes to wear. Molly glanced down at her bright red coat and wished she didn't grow so fast. The coat had been a Christmas gift when she turned 6 for the journey to the New World. It was frayed at the hem, but the buttons were still shiny. She had worn it especially because if you looked nice, people wanted to buy from you. If you looked poor, they walked the other way. It took her almost an hour to reach the spot she had decided on for today. The bank was to the left, the garment shop to the right, and behind her was the bakery. If she was lucky, all 3 businesses would be busy today, bringing more passers-by to possibly buy a ribbon. Her tummy growled, but she ignored it. She hadn't had breakfast because she didn't want to take the last piece of bread. If her mother woke up, she hoped she would eat. She hadn't eaten in days. The snow began whispering from the clouds, and Molly smiled. Snow always made her think of God and how he blessed them, because her father reminded her every night that they might not have everything they wanted, but they had to count every blessing they did have. Ribbons, ribbons, only a pence apiece. Molly began calling out in her sweet voice. When she first started selling ribbons a few months ago, she had been shy, but Molly had soon learned that being shy didn't sell ribbons. She glanced in the direction of the harbor. Although she couldn't see it from her corner, she could only imagine how blustery the wind must be there. She quickly prayed that her father had managed to get work today. She couldn't stand her mother becoming even more ill. Chapter 2. Morning turned to noon, and Molly became a little concerned because she'd only sold 3 ribbons so far. Her legs were tired and she was cold, but she didn't go home. She wanted to surprise her father with a pocket full of coins, not just the 3 coins she had now. She watched as a family walked out of the bakery and couldn't seem to drag her eyes away. The mother was dressed in a beautiful coat, her hair intricately braided with ribbons. The father wore a suit and an overcoat. His shoes were shinier than any Molly had ever seen before. But it was the little girl who walked between them who captured Molly's interest. The little girl wore a red coat, very similar to Molly's, and held a doll in her arms. The girl's hat was woolen and probably new. Her black shoes were just as shiny as her father's. The mother and father laughed together before smiling down at their daughter. Molly could smell the scent of the freshly baked bread they had just purchased from across the road, and her tummy growled again. She thought of the 3 coins in her pocket. She could afford at least a fresh bun, but she wouldn't buy one. She'd rather sell more ribbons. Ribbons, ribbons, come choose your favorite color, Molly called out. The little girl with the doll glanced at her and quickly looked away. Molly squared her shoulders, refusing to feel ashamed that she had to sell ribbons instead of playing with dolls. Besides, she had no dolls with which to play. "I'd like a ribbon," a voice said behind her. Molly turned to find a beautiful woman smiling down at her. The black woolen coat she wore smelt wonderful, and there wasn't a hint of dirt on her face. She had clearly taken her weekly bath that morning. "What color?" Molly asked, holding out the basket. The lady smiled before looking through the colors. "I think a red one. What do you think? Seems fitting for Christmas." Molly smiled brightly, hoping her smile would entice the lady to take 2 ribbons instead of just 1. "The green ones are just as nice for Christmas." The lady winked. "Maybe next time." She took the red ribbon and handed Molly a coin before turning and walking away. Molly watched her join a man in a long overcoat and top hat. How she wished she could be that beautiful lady being waited for by a man wearing a top hat. She sighed and turned around. 4 ribbons, she'd sold 4 so far, only 16 more to go. As the temperatures dropped with the advent of the afternoon, so did the number of people on the street. Molly watched the bank close first at around 3 o'clock. Next would be the garment shop, she thought a while later when the proprietor stepped outside and locked up. Her last hope was the bakery, but the baker stepped out and locked the doors before casting Molly a distracted smile. He turned, waved, and walked away in the opposite direction. Molly sank down into the snow and shook her head. A tear slipped down her cheeks, even as a snowflake settled on her nose. She was surrounded by people who could afford a basket of ribbons, and they wouldn't even buy one. A horse-drawn carriage approached at a trot, and Molly's tears disappeared as she dreamed of one day riding in a carriage. The carriage bounced through a puddle, soaking Molly's red coat in mud. The tears burned the back of her eyes again as she glanced down at her ruined coat. Regardless of whether or not she wanted to stay out, she wouldn't be selling any more ribbons today. No one would buy from her looking like a pauper. Walking home, she couldn't help but admire the Christmas trees through the windows of the homes. Here and there she saw people holding gifts. Some of the houses in this part of town were even decorated with holly. Molly walked slowly, taking it all in and promising herself that one day Christmas would be about gifts and trees and happiness for her as well. She tried to imagine what it would be like to be rich and not have to worry about money for coal or being able to afford basics such as food and clothes. If she could just have everything she needed and indulge in the festivities of Christmas instead of worrying over day-to-day troubles such as putting food on the table tonight. A man walked past her with a top hat and a cane. Molly smiled up at him brightly. Hello. She didn't know why she thought so, but she imagined that maybe if he just acknowledged her, she wouldn't feel so invisible. The man stopped and smiled. Merry Christmas, young lady. He tilted his hat as if Molly was a real lady and then walked away. Hope bloomed in her chest. Perhaps one day she would be important enough for men to tilt their hats whenever she walked by. Molly's heart skipped a beat at the thought. She didn't even notice a man crossing the street to reach her. Are you selling those ribbons? Molly nodded. I was, but... She glanced down at her mud-splattered coat. I'm going home now. How many ribbons do you have left? He asked, bending over to look her in the eyes. Molly shrugged. 16 ribbons. I'll take them all, he said, reaching for his wallet. My little girl simply loves ribbons, and I only have 2 gifts for her for Christmas. Hopefully, this will make up for it. Molly accepted the money, grateful that her ribbons were sold. She could not help but wonder, though, how it would be to have a father who wanted to present more than 2 gifts for Christmas. She watched him walk away and knew her father would have given her the world if he could. Chapter 3. Molly arrived back in the Lower East Side in the late afternoon. Her socks were soaked through from the mud off the carriage, and her coat was in an awful mess. She was shivering as she walked up to her tenement block and climbed the stairs to their one-roomed home. She heard Mrs. Gardner call out. Molly turned to see their neighbor standing outside, waving to her. Molly ran the last few steps to reach Mrs. Gardner, who never called out unless she had a treat to offer her. Her tummy was aching by now, and she couldn't wait to see what Mrs. Gardner had for her today. There you are. Dear girl, you shouldn't be out in this weather. You'll catch your death. Mrs. Gardner scowled even as she handed Molly a large cookie. I baked some biscuits and knew you'd like one. Molly all but scoffed the biscuit down, her tummy growling hungrily as it realized food was on the way. Mrs. Gardner smiled sympathetically. Let me fetch you another one. She returned a few seconds later with another cookie. Here you go. Now you best get inside. Thank you, Mrs. Gardner, Molly said as she headed to their own door. She wouldn't eat the other cookie now. She'd share it with her parents as a Christmas Eve treat. She carefully opened the door, not wanting to wake her mother if she was still asleep. The room was dark, but fortunately warmer than outside. If her father brought more coal when he got home, they would be able to make it even warmer. She set her basket down and took off the dirty coat and boots before going to check on her mother. A frown creased Molly's tiny brow as she leaned over her mother. Molly didn't know much about being sick, but she was pretty sure her mother shouldn't be sweating in this cold. Nor should she be as white as the bed sheets. Mama, wake up, Molly urged, touching her mother's shoulder. Molly, her mother's voice was hoarse and tired. You're home. I sold all the ribbons, Mama, Molly said proudly. I knew you would. You've always been my little star. A cough escaped her mother, and it didn't sound healthy. Her mother wiped her mouth with a kerchief, and Molly saw a speck of red when she put it away. Blood. Molly's little heart began to race. Mama, I'm going to fetch the doctor. No, Molly, don't fetch him. It will cost too much for him to come. Besides, it's just the flu. But I can pay him, Molly said tearfully as she pulled the coins from her pocket. Look, I've got money. Her mother closed her hand over Molly's. Keep your money for food, Molly. Don't go wasting it on a doctor. Molly shook her head. Then let me fetch Mrs. Gardner. She'll know what to do. No, don't go. Come lie down with me. I want to hold you, her mother said with a sad smile. Molly glanced at the door. No, I need to fetch Mrs. Gardner. Molly, please, come lie with me. I want to hold you. I missed you today, her mother's voice almost pleaded. Molly could still hear the Irish lilt in her mother's tone. Although her father was English, her mother had been raised in Ireland before her family moved to London. Molly sighed heavily, but she obeyed her mother's wishes. She climbed onto the bed with her mother. Are you very sick, Mama? Her mother coughed again. A little, but I just need to rest a little, and then I'll be better. I promise, Molly nodded. Can I pray for you? Of course you can, my dear girl, her mother said, and Molly saw a tear slip from her mother's eye. God, please make my mama better. Please take away the sick and let her be healthy again. Amen. Thank you. That was a beautiful prayer. Molly nodded and settled into her mother's arms. After a while, she felt her mother's chest begin to move less. She glanced up to find that her mother had fallen asleep again. Molly wasn't concerned because her mother had taught her that nothing heals like sleep. Perhaps when her mother woke up, she would be all better, Molly reasoned. Slowly, she began to feel warm lying next to her mother. She thought of the cookie they could share tonight, even as she remembered the man who had bought ribbons from her. What was that little girl doing now? Molly imagined the little girl playing in the warmth of a fireplace, with biscuits and milk standing close by for when she got hungry and thirsty. Molly didn't how long she imagined being that little girl without a care in the world. When the door opened and her father stepped inside, she jumped up and rushed to him. "Merry Christmas, Daddy." "Merry Christmas, my Molly girl." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Molly held him tight regardless of the fishy stench of the harbor that clung to his clothes. When her father brought the stench of fish home, it meant he had worked that day and they would eat that night. Chapter 4. Molly finally let go of her father and watched him remove his coat and hang it on the hook behind the door before she remembered about her mother. "Daddy?" Mama coughed blood. She didn't realize it then, but she'd never forget the look of dread in her father's eyes. He rushed towards the bed, kneeling by its side as he began calling her mother's name. Molly didn't know what was going on, but when her father began ripping the sheets and the bedspread off her mother, she knew something was wrong. "Daddy?" "She's burning up, Molly. We need the doctor. Go, Molly, now. Run as fast as you can and tell him to come quick," her father called out, wetting a cloth under the faucet. Her little heart raced as she hurried to get into her coat and pull on her boots. "Is she very sick?" Molly asked as she rushed to the door. "Molly, just go. Run," her father shouted urgently as he wiped her mother's face with the wet cloth. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her. She didn't care about the dirty coat or the mud on her shoes. She only cared about getting to the doctor. When the doctor opened the door to her hammering, he made it clear that she had interrupted his dinner. Molly wouldn't let him intimidate her. She squared her shoulders, even as tears streamed over her cheeks. "You have to come. My mommy is sick. Daddy says you need to come right quick." The doctor nodded even as he reached for his coat and a bag by the door. Together, they rushed back through the grimy streets with snow falling now in heavy drifts. Molly didn't notice the cold or the doctor asking her to slow down. All she noticed was their building in the distance and the need to get there as quickly as possible. Molly opened the door, breathless. Her lungs were burning, and she had a stinging pain in her side as she turned to her father. "He's coming. He's coming." But her father didn't look happy. He shook his head as Molly moved towards him. She had inherited his green eyes, but they weren't green now. They were red-rimmed and sad. "Daddy?" The doctor rushed into the room and kneeled on the side of the bed. He pulled out a funny-looking thing and put parts in his ear before holding another part on her mother's chest. She watched as he looked up and shook his head. "It's too late," 3 words slipped from her father's lips before he dropped his face in his hands. Molly glanced from the doctor to her father, shaking her head. "Mommy?" Molly asked, confused. "She's gone, Molly. She's gone," her father said before his shoulders heaved with the sobs. Molly shook her head. "But I did as you said. I fetched the doctor." The doctor glanced at Molly with sympathy in his gaze. "If only you'd fetched me sooner." Guilt washed over Molly as she took a few steps back. It was all her fault. Her mother was dead, and it was all her fault. If only she had fetched the doctor sooner, her mother would still be alive, and her father wouldn't be crying in the corner of the room. If she fetched the doctor sooner, they could have shared the cookie for Christmas Eve. Instead, their Christmas Eve was spent in silence once her mother's body was collected by the funeral parlor. The money Molly had earned from selling ribbons was handed to the undertaker with the promise of more. Molly never touched the other cookie. On the day of her mother's funeral, she dropped it in the grave, hoping the cookie would make up for her allowing her mother to die. Her father stood over her mother's grave with defeat shining in his eyes, and Molly couldn't help but feel responsible. Although he tried not to cry in front of her, at night Molly heard the sobs coming from his side of the room. Tears would quietly flow over her own cheeks as she tried to forget about the ache in her heart. At the age of 8, Molly learned something else. She learned about death. Chapter 5, 9 years later. It was the 23rd of December, just a day before Christmas Eve. While the rest of New York prepared for Christmas and the festivities of the holiday season, Molly stood in the cemetery holding a black umbrella. Snow had lost its magic for her 9 years ago. Her cheeks were dry, but her boots were wet. Since they buried her mother the day after Christmas 9 years ago, Molly had learned that tears don't soothe heartache. It only brought about a headache. She had cried for her father briefly after she had been notified of the accident at the harbor, but once the tears had been shed, she had done what needed to be done. Funeral arrangements had been made between shifts at her 2 jobs. Her father didn't own a suit, so she had taken money from the tin they kept hidden in the icebox. She wouldn't let her father be buried without dignity. The preacher closed the Bible and met Molly's gaze before he nodded at the men standing on either side of the grave. She watched her father's coffin being lowered into the ground and bit down hard on her lip, hoping it would transfer the pain from her heart. An accident, the harbor master had said when he handed Molly the envelope the day before. He wouldn't expand on what had taken her father's life, but promised her that the envelope would take care of her for at least a few months. When the coffin reached the bottom of the grave, Molly's breath caught in her throat. She was now completely alone in the world. She had no family. She glanced at the preacher and wondered what good all her praying had done her. She had prayed for her mother to get better, but God had called her mother home. She had prayed for a better life for her and her father, but now God had called him home as well. For Molly, life was nothing but a struggle, and she was tired of hoping for more when it was clear that God didn't care for her at all. She remembered the cookie she had so foolishly dropped into her mother's grave and knew she wasn't the same little girl she had been back then. She was now a young woman responsible for her own fate, and without her father, a future in New York seemed bleaker than ever before. Molly had heard stories of what happened to girls who couldn't look out for themselves. She knew about the pleasure houses and the wagons heading west, bearing dancing girls to entertain men in the frontier towns. But she wasn't weak. She assured herself as she turned away from the grave and began walking home. She would be strong. Molly didn't know where she would get the strength to get through losing another parent, but she knew she had no other choice. When she arrived home, she changed out of her funeral clothes into a comfortable dress and made a pot of tea. Over the last few years, life had somewhat improved from the time soon after their arrival in New York, but not so much that they could afford a better apartment or lavish dinners. Every penny was turned over 4 times before it served its purpose, and Molly knew that, without her father's wages, she would be turning pennies over now more than ever. With a cup of tea in hand, Molly collected the money tin from the icebox as well as the envelope from the harbor master. She counted the money carefully before she began making little cash piles. By the time she was done, she had 18 little heaps on the table. A sigh escaped her, although she didn't know if it was out of fear or relief as she began putting the money back in the tin. She had enough money for rent for 18 months. That meant she had 18 months in which to earn better wages. She worked at the bank as a cleaner in the evenings and in the mornings. She stocked shelves at the general grocer down the road. Although she had 2 jobs, she barely earned enough to cover her living expenses. If she had to pay the rent as well. Molly placed the tin in the icebox and glanced at the Bible on the table. She needed help, but she didn't think God even knew she existed. Why else would he have lured her and her family to New York from London, only to suffer a worse fate than they had there? This new world had taken both her parents from her, and Molly knew if she wasn't careful, it would take her dignity as well. She opened the hope chest that her mother had brought with her from Ireland as a young woman and carefully unpacked her most prized possessions. First was a blanket that her mother had knitted for the journey to the new world. A small box held her father's pocket watch and her mother's earrings. It didn't matter how hard times were, her mother had refused to sell her earrings. Next was a beautiful teapot and cups that her father had told her came all the way from China. There were a few other items of value, but for Molly, the most valuable thing in the chest was a picture of her parents on their wedding day. The photo had cost them a month's rent, but her mother had insisted she wanted something to remember their wedding day by. Molly couldn't be more grateful now, because now at least she had something to remember her parents by. A knock at the door had Molly quickly replacing the items in the chest before opening the door. "Sarah?" Molly asked, surprised. Sarah smiled brightly. "Oh, Molly, I'm so glad I caught you. I'm so sorry I didn't make the funeral this morning. Black just doesn't suit me at all." She chuckled at her own joke as she walked into the room. Molly had met Sarah a year ago when she started working at the general grocer. Sarah was the proprietor's daughter, and although they were worlds apart in position in society, Sarah had become her friend. "It's fine," Molly conceded. She would ponder on Sarah's terrible excuse later. Right now, she was just glad to be distracted from her sadness. "I just wanted to make sure you're still coming to the wedding?" Sarah asked with a hopeful look. Molly shook her head. "I don't know. I really don't think your father will want me there." "Nonsense. My father doesn't have a say in the matter. You're my friend, and I want you to come to the wedding. I know you'll say you don't have anything to wear, so I brought you something." She opened the door and picked up a box she had left outside, handing it to Molly. Molly frowned as she opened the box, surprised at the beautiful dress inside. "Sarah, it's yours. I'd like you to be my maid of honor." Molly felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. She felt honored that Sarah had asked her instead of one of her many other friends. "Of course I'll come," Molly promised. "Wonderful. Christmas Eve, 6 p.m. We'll see you then." Sarah left, clearly pleased with herself. Molly glanced down at the dress in the box and carefully lifted it out. It was a pale rose color, the skirt billowing from the waist and the bodice beautifully embroidered with small roses. It was the most beautiful dress Molly had ever owned. She carefully placed it back in the box, conceding that going to the wedding would be better than spending Christmas at home. After losing her mother on Christmas Eve, Molly and her father did not celebrate the day again. With her father passing so shortly before Christmas, Molly knew how hard her first Christmas alone would be. She carefully placed the box beneath the bed and knew that she wasn't really completely alone. She had a friend in Sarah. Chapter 6. The following evening, when Molly returned from work, Mrs. Gardner was waiting for her. A sigh escaped Molly, knowing she did not have the energy for her elderly neighbor. When she awoke that morning, it was with the realization that her father's death had started to dawn on her. Molly couldn't help but wish that she had a wealthy father who would secure a marriage for her. She loved Sarah dearly, but she couldn't help but envy her friend. Once Sarah was married, her husband would care for her, and Sarah would never again have a care in the world. "How are you doing, my dear girl?" Mrs. Gardner asked as Molly approached the door. "I'm so sorry I didn't come to your father's funeral. I had a terrible cold. Luckily, it's gone now." Molly smiled kindly, knowing she wouldn't get Mrs. Gardner to leave until she had said what she had come to say. "It's perfectly in order. It was a dreary day. It wouldn't have been good for you." "Right, but that's not why I'm here. I wonder if you have time for a cup of tea?" Mrs. Gardner reached into her bag and pulled out a small container. "I brought biscuits." A smile curved Molly's mouth as she glanced at the treats. "That was very kind of you. I'll make us some tea." While the tea brewed, Mrs. Gardner asked Molly about work and what her plans were for the future. Molly couldn't help but feel a little intimidated by the sudden barrage of questions, especially since she didn't know what she was going to do. She had 18 months left in which to decide. Once the tea was poured, She joined Mrs. Gardner at the table and noticed that she had somehow conjured a newspaper as well. "Molly, have you heard of the Matrimonial Times?" Molly shook her head. "No, I've heard of the Times, though." "This is nothing like the Times," Mrs. Gardner corrected, opening the newspaper for Molly to see. "My dear girl, with both your parents gone, there's nothing left for you in New York. I know the long hours you work just to make ends meet. Without a father, you're almost certainly not going to secure an engagement." Molly laughed wryly. "Thank you for pointing that out." "I'm not being rude. I have a plan," Mrs. Gardner announced, holding up the paper. "Have you heard of mail-order brides?" Molly shook her head. "No." "Well, let me explain it to you. You see, many girls in the East share your plight. Cities are expensive in which to live, especially if you're living alone and earning a woman's wages. I was lucky enough to have my son become a doctor. If it wasn't for his kindness, I would have been skint a long time ago." Molly nodded, not sure where this story was headed. "I know how expensive the city is." "Right. Well, this is the solution to all your problems. You see, men who want a wife write to the Matrimonial Times. Throughout most cities in the West, the men outnumber the women sixfold. That means you have many willing and eager husbands, but no brides." Mrs. Gardner took a sip of her tea before she continued. "They place an advertisement of what they're looking for in a wife in this paper. Potential brides then choose a man with whom to correspond. After writing letters for a few months, a proposal usually follows. You can write them, Molly. You can find a husband in the West." Molly flinched. "I'm lonely, Mrs. Gardner, not desperate." "Who says these women correspondents are desperate? I know of 2 girls who found true love and headed west to marry their husbands. It's not perfect, I agree. It would be better if you could meet him first, but it's an option. It's a way for you to stop working your fingers to the bone only to eat bread." Molly shook her head and stood up. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Gardner, but I don't think I want to marry a desperate man whom I've never met. I'm happy for those girls if they found happiness, but I'm not writing to a complete stranger in the hopes of garnering a proposal." Mrs. Gardner shook her head with a sigh. "I wish you'd at least consider it, Molly. I've watched you struggle ever since you arrived 11 years ago. Your parents had been so excited about all the opportunities, and yet they only found heartache and loss in this city. I don't want to watch you lose that spark in your eye." "I won't," Molly assured her. "I'll be just fine. I think there's a perfect man out there for you. In the West, they don't care about wealth and a place in society. They're just looking for someone to love and with whom to start a family. Surely it's something you should think about? If not now, maybe in a month or two." "I appreciate that you care, but I'm not interested," Molly insisted curtly. "Molly, just remember that God can only help us if we want to help ourselves." Molly nodded. "I think God only helps those he likes. It's clear he hasn't liked me and my family all that much." Mrs. Gardner's face contorted with a frown. "My dear girl, surely you don't mean that." "I do," Molly said, convinced. "God never promised us riches and an easy life. He only promised to pick us up when we fall. Don't lose faith. If you have to lose faith in this place, I'll understand, but don't lose faith in God. He cares for you even if you stopped caring for him." Molly took a deep breath, wishing Mrs. Gardner could be right. "Thank you for coming." Mrs. Gardner collected her things and turned to Molly with a curious look. "Jeremiah 29, verse 11. A smile softened her face. "He hasn't forgotten about you, Molly, I promise." Molly closed the door and couldn't help but be curious about the verse Mrs. Gardner had quoted. She walked over to the Bible and opened it. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." A tear slipped over Molly's cheek as she read the verse over and over again. When she finally closed the Bible, she glanced up at the leaky roof. "What plans do you have for me? All I've known is loss and hardship. Lord, what plans do you have that will let me prosper?" A resounding silence persisted in the room, but that one verse had given Molly what she had needed since her father's passing. It gave her hope. Chapter 7. On Christmas Eve, Molly was the only person to arrive at Sarah's parents' brownstone home on foot. Carriages pulled up to disgorge beautifully clad guests who glided up the stairs and in through the front door. For a moment, Molly stood outside, coming to the realization that she didn't belong among the wealthy people attending the wedding. She considered turning around and going home, but the thought of spending Christmas Eve alone was even more intimidating. She took a deep breath and climbed the stairs. She'd never been to Sarah's house before and suddenly wondered at the reason. As soon as she stepped inside, the housekeeper approached her. "Are you Molly? Sarah said you'd be arriving alone and wearing this dress." Molly nodded. "Yes, I am." "Good, come with me. Sarah's waiting for you. I must say, that dress flatters you more than it ever flattered her." The housekeeper winked, but Molly couldn't help but feel a little thwarted. She had thought Sarah had bought her the dress, rather than it being a dress she no longer wanted. She was shown to a bedroom on the first floor. The ceilings were high and the carpets thick. In the center of the room stood a four-poster bed that reminded Molly of the fairy tales her mother had told her as a little girl. When she noticed Sarah in her wedding dress, her smile simply broadened. "Sarah, you look magnificent." "Good, you're here. I was afraid you wouldn't come." "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss being your maid of honor," Molly said kindly. "Are you nervous?" Sarah shook her head. "No. Morgan Taylor is a banker, so father assures me it's a good match. I've only met him once or twice, but he seems nice." Molly nodded, not sure how to respond. They were called downstairs a short while later. The house was lavishly decorated for Christmas Eve, with holly over every doorway and an ornate Christmas tree in the center of the parlor, decorated with baubles and ribbons. Molly was simply in awe at the obvious wealth displayed in the room as she glanced around. She overheard a conversation about Sarah's father and hid her surprise when she found out that he owned more shops in New York. Morgan was a very attractive man, Molly observed as she took her place beside Sarah. The ceremony was short but beautiful. When the wedding celebrations began, Molly excused herself for a moment to gain control of her emotions. Seeing Sarah's father give her away had been a ruthless reminder that Molly's own father would never give her away. She slipped into the dining room and moved to the corner to peer out the window. The candles hadn't been lit yet, and the room was dark, which meant that the three women who entered sometime after her didn't even notice Molly standing by the window. "Do you know who the maid of honor is?" one woman asked. "No, but Sarah told me it was simply too hard to choose between us. I think she works for Sarah's father." "You mean in the shop?" another voice asked, shocked. The first voice answered, "Yes." Molly felt her heart begin to race as they discussed how her red hair clashed with the dress. She had never known women could be so mean. When they finally left, Molly went in search of Sarah. She wanted to say goodbye before she headed home. A smile curved her mouth when she saw Sarah talking to her father. "What is she doing here, Sarah?" "Father, I invited her. We're friends." "You will not shame Morgan by being friends with her a second longer. It's bad enough she's wearing one of your dresses. Careful, or she might share your husband as well." Molly stopped a few steps away, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Father, Molly isn't like that," Sarah argued. Her father laughed wryly. "Sarah, all women are like that when they need money badly enough." "Your father is right. I can't entertain a friendship between you and that woman," Morgan said, joining the conversation. "What will my mother say?" Molly gasped at their cruel words, and Sarah turned and met her gaze. Molly didn't wait to hear another word. She rushed through the wealthy guests and straight out into the cold, without so much as collecting her coat on the way out. She walked home in the cold and couldn't help but notice as families celebrated Christmas Eve inside warm homes. By the time she stepped into her cold apartment, she knew what had happened wasn't Sarah's fault. It was the fault of a society that relied on wealth and class to forge relationships. She changed into her nightdress, feeling inadequate and worthless. When she crawled into bed, tears were still streaming down her cheeks. Perhaps Mrs. Gardner was right. She would never find her happiness in New York. Perhaps she needed to consider writing to one of the men in the West. The thought of writing to a stranger in the hopes of a proposal seemed even more horrifying than a lonely future. She had no family, and she had lost her only friend. Once again, Christmas had brought her nothing but heartache. Molly cried herself asleep, wishing that Christmas could just be over. Chapter 8. 2 years later. Molly hadn't taken into account an increase in rent when she had calculated the 18 months. As a result, her money had barely lasted 13 months. It was just after Thanksgiving, and Molly couldn't help but face the brutal reality of her situation. She was working 2 jobs already, leaving no time for a third. Since February, paying the rent had been a problem. When the first month rolled around and Molly realized she wouldn't be able to make rent, she took in laundry. With the money she earned from laundering, she barely managed the rent, but every penny helped. She convinced herself when she looked at her bruised and chapped hands. After the first warning of eviction arrived in July, Molly had opened her hope chest for the first time in years. Piece by piece, she had sold every last item in the hope chest to make up her arrear rent. But when August rolled around, Molly had nothing left to sell inside the hope chest. The photo of her parents held no value, or she would likely have sold it too. She had started by selling the chairs as she only needed one. Next had come the table and the mattress she had slept on as a child. Today she had sold her bed, but she was still short to pay the rent. She arrived home to find a basket of laundry waiting on her doorstep, together with a letter from the landlord. The eviction notice brought more fear and dread than previously, because this time Molly had nothing left to sell. Once she had set the basket inside and placed the eviction notice on the crate she now used as a table, Molly let out a heavy sigh. She remembered the words of Sarah's father 2 years ago, and suddenly it wasn't that hard to understand what he had meant. Molly had nothing and no one left in her life, and only a month until the landlord would evict her. Her future was now even bleaker than on the day she had stood beside her father's grave. Her clothes sagged from the weight she had lost, and the constant ache in her tummy had become part of who she was. At an age when most girls were courting and getting married, Molly just wished her life to be over. She reminded herself every single day of the verse Mrs. Gardner had quoted her, and yet she was still waiting for God to provide. The hope chest caught her eye, and Molly wondered if someone would be interested in buying it. A tear slipped silently over her cheek. She had tried to find work that would earn her more wages, but a woman didn't earn the same wages as men. It didn't matter the work. All the employers offered women the same wages. Once or twice, Molly had thought of saving her money and returning to the home of her birth, but she didn't have 2 dimes to rub together. Never mind save. Christmas was looming on the horizon like a dark cloud about to burst. This time, Molly didn't even try and be hopeful that Christmas would be different. By Christmas, she would be homeless, starving, and probably too weak to work. A sob escaped her as he shook her head. There was nothing more she could do, and no one she could turn to. After her wedding, Sarah had obeyed her father and husband's orders. She hadn't seen Sarah apart from those occasions when she stopped by the store. Molly knew that Sarah had given birth to a little girl earlier that year. She was so happy for her friend, but couldn't help but wish some of her friend's happiness for herself. Molly took a deep breath and pushed the tears aside as a rat skittered across the floor. "Sorry, little rat, there's no food here." Molly stood up and collected the basket of laundry to begin washing. Tears wouldn't change her situation, and hopefully the laundry would take her mind off how dire her situation was. With the laundry finished, Molly hung the wet items by the coal stove, knowing that the heat was more important to dry the clothes than it was to keep her warm. She moved to her closet to look for dresses she might be able to sell, but the only one of any worth was from Sarah. She hung it back in the closet with a heavy heart. She simply didn't have the heart to sell it. A knock at the door startled her. Molly quickly brushed the tears from her face as she walked to the door. She was not accustomed to receiving visitors and knew that it was probably just someone knocking on the wrong door. She opened the door and was surprised to find Mrs. Gardner standing on the threshold, holding a plate of stew in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. "Well then, aren't you going to invite an old lady inside?" Molly smiled and opened the door wider. "Come in, Mrs. Gardner." She had no idea what harebrained idea Mrs. Gardner had today, but she was willing to listen if it meant the chance to enjoy that serving of stew. Chapter 9. I know you're probably busy, but I made some stew and thought you'd like some, Mrs. Gardner said, stepping into the room. Her brow furrowed as she glanced around. Molly, where is your furniture? Molly shrugged. Thank you for the stew. I really appreciate it. Molly accepted the plate even as she directed Mrs. Gardner to the crate. You can sit there. And you? Heavens, where do you sleep? I have a bedroll, Molly said shyly. The money she had left over after selling the bed had more than covered the cost of a second-hand bedroll. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping directly on the floor. Mrs. Gardner clucked her tongue as Molly sat down on a crate and began to eat. It's even worse than I thought. When I heard you were taking in laundry, I knew it was bad, but I had no idea it was this bad. If I'd known. Things will get better, Molly assured her between mouthfuls of hearty stew. Mrs. Gardner shook her head and frowned. Don't you lie to me now, Molly. How bad is it? Is it true you're being evicted? Molly met the older lady's eyes. She'd known Mrs. Gardner from the tender age of 6 and couldn't lie to her. It's bad. I can't manage the rent. With 2 jobs and the laundry, I'm simply not making ends meet. I've sold what I can to help catch up on the rent that was behind, but I fell behind again. I can't help you with your rent. We're barely getting by as it is, but I do have a solution to your problems. Mrs. Gardner held up the sheaf of papers. Before you say anything, you'll read these. His name is Howard Grover, and he lives in Colorado. Just read them, Molly. Molly finished her stew and reached for the sheaf of papers. A frown creased her brow as she read the first letter. Dear Molly, thank you for your letter. I enjoyed reading about life in New York and how different it is from Colorado. I live in a small town on a ranch with my sister. We're not wealthy by any means, like some of the people you mentioned in your letter, but we have enough food and we get by. As I mentioned in my advertisement, I'm looking for an honest and hardworking woman to join me on the ranch. I run a few head of cattle, and we grow most of what we eat. I don't think it would be realistic to say that I'm looking for true love, but rather a partner in life. I'd like to have a family one day to take over the ranch, so I'll be upfront about wanting children in the future. I'm a hard worker, honest, and loyal. I'm quite tall, with dark brown hair and light brown eyes. I've been in Colorado now for 10 years, and I hope to spend the rest of my days in this beautiful country. You sound like a nice lady, and I'd love to hear from you again. I was very sorry to read about your parents. I too lost my parents and know what a large hole that leaves in your life. I know you don't know me, but I want to assure you that if you choose to move to Colorado, you'll have family here. My sister is very eager to have female company on the ranch. I won't expect you to work the cattle or farm the land, but I hope a little housekeeping, cooking, and maybe some laundry wouldn't be asking too much. I hope to hear from you again soon. Yours in hope, Howard Grover. Molly's jaw dropped as she turned to Mrs. Gardner. I never wrote him a letter. I've never even heard of him before. Mrs. Gardner chuckled softly. I did, Molly. Right about the first time I heard you were being evicted. Knew I had to do something since you refused to. Now go on, read the rest of them. Molly shook her head. I can't believe you wrote to a stranger on my behalf. Good thing I know you quite well, isn't it? Mrs. Gardner smiled. Molly narrowed her eyes before she picked up the next letter. My dearest Molly, it was so good to hear from you again. Summer is also heating up the days here in Colorado. With summer comes much hard work for us. We brand the steers and take the other cattle to auction. Sometimes a cattle drive can take weeks on the trail. It's hard work, but I enjoy it. I'm sorry to hear you had to take in doing laundry as well. I can only imagine how tired you must be after working 2 jobs and having to do other people's laundry. I'm glad to hear that you also look forward to having a family one day. My sister insisted she be named godmother when I told her about you. I know this might seem strange, but I feel as if I already know you. When I received your letter, I was so pleased that you told me a little more about yourself. I've only once seen a woman with hair like fire. I can only imagine how pretty it must look on you, given your green eyes. I don't mind a slight temper. Unlike some men, I believe a woman has a right to stand up for what she believes in, within reason, of course. I find it hard to believe that a woman like you hasn't already found love in a city like New York. Either the men back east are blind, or fate had been keeping you from me. Please write again, Molly. This time tell me if you'll be willing to live on a ranch. I can't stand looking forward to meeting you if this isn't something you'll consider. Yours truly, Howard Grover. How many letters are there? Molly asked when she finished the second letter. Mrs. Gardner smiled. A few more. He's quite the writer, isn't he? I don't know what to say. I can't believe you did this. Keep that self-righteousness under a lid just now and keep reading, Mrs. Gardner said sharply as she stood up to pour herself more tea. Molly read 3 more letters. In each of them, she learned more about Howard Grover. He seemed like a kind and humble man. He didn't have big dreams beyond having a family and a wife. His sister sounded like a nice woman who was herself yet to court. By the 5th letter, Molly felt as if she knew Howard Grover and as if he knew her. He promised there would always be flour to bake with since she was so fond of biscuits, and that sentence brought a smile to her face. She had no idea who he was or why Mrs. Gardner had chosen to write to him, but she couldn't help but wonder if he would be as nice in real life as he was in the letters. When she finished the final letter, she turned to Mrs. Gardner. I don't know why you did this, but I'm not going to write to him. I don't even know him. Oh, you don't have to write, dear. There's 1 more letter from him. She took out the letter and handed it to Molly with a grin. Hopefully this one will change your mind. Chapter 10. Molly opened the letter and couldn't stop the smile that curved her mouth at the opening. My beloved Molly. It's taken me a week to finish this letter simply because I didn't know which words would achieve the result I prayed for. I have never loved before, but by reading your words and learning about your life, I've fallen in love with you. Whenever I look out over the ranch with the sun rising in the east, I think of you and wonder if you're looking at the sun and thinking about me. My sister thinks it might be too soon, but I assured her that it feels right. Nothing has ever felt more right than writing this letter. Please don't decide without giving it some thought first. You'll find a train ticket included with this letter. The ticket will take you from New York to Denver, where I will collect you in my wagon. I know the journey might be intimidating, but I have been assured that traveling by train is safe for a young lady traveling alone. You might wonder why I'm asking you to come, and I'll be happy to explain. I have a feeling you're the wife I've been praying for. I don't want to scare you off with a wedding proposal. Instead, I want to invite you to come and stay with me and my sister. If we are a match, as I have no doubt we are, we could be married before Christmas. If you arrive and you feel that I am not the man I have portrayed in my letters, you will be free to leave at any time. You have my word on that, and that I will pay for your return ticket. I know some essentials are required for a journey of this length, and I've included a money order for exchange at the bank for the funds you'll need for those essentials. If this will help you decide, I will be honest and admit that nothing would give me greater pleasure than meeting you. Don't reply, because I hope your answer is the one I prayed for. I'll be waiting for you in Denver on the 1st of December. I'll be wearing a brown coat and a beaten hat. To make sure you recognize me, I'll also wear a yellow ribbon. Please come, my darling Molly. Come and meet me and see if we can build a future together. With love and anticipation, Howard Grover. Molly's heart skipped a beat as she read the last sentence again. Could it be possible that a complete stranger would want to build a future with her? She slowly shook her head as she turned to Mrs. Gardner. You can't really expect me to go? Mrs. Gardner shrugged and held out the money order and the train ticket. The train leaves in 2 days. This man can give you a future, a home, and quite possibly love. What is there to consider? He might give me to the savages or sell me to pleasure houses. Have you considered that? Molly asked, terrified at the thought. Mrs. Gardner narrowed her eyes. Do you honestly think he'll go to all this trouble just to sell you? Don't be ridiculous. This man sounds like a good person, and he has his sister living with him. Surely that should set your mind at ease about his intentions. Molly shook her head. I don't know. Mrs. Gardner stood up and cocked her hands on her hips. What is there to know? Take it down to basics then. He's offering you food and shelter. In less than a week, you won't have either in New York. Is there really a choice to make here? Don't let your pride and fear hold you back. Sometimes we have to leap. But what if I fall? Molly asked in a small voice. Mrs. Gardner reached for Molly's hand and squeezed it tightly. There's nowhere to fall from where you're at. You've hit rock bottom, regardless of all your hard work. Take the leap. What if you fly? You might just find happiness for a change. Molly tugged her bottom lip between her teeth and read the last letter again. He offered to pay her return fare if she wasn't happy. Shouldn't that be enough to set her mind at ease? She thought of the other letters and the type of man they portrayed. If she was completely honest with herself, he sounded like a wonderful man, and any woman would be lucky to be his wife. Maybe Mrs. Gardner was right. Perhaps it was time Molly tried to find her own luck. She had nothing to lose, and in less than a week, she wouldn't even have a home. She met Mrs. Gardner's anxious gaze and slowly nodded. I'll go. Mrs. Gardner clapped her hands together. Really? That's wonderful. You're doing the right thing, Molly, I'm sure of it. You best get to bed because we've got a busy day tomorrow. I have to work. Molly trailed off when Mrs. Gardner laughed. Work? You have to pack, my dear child. We need to exchange that money order and get what you'll need for your journey west. I see you have a chest. We can use that for packing, and I'll bake you some biscuits as well. I'm so happy you've decided to go. Molly nodded as a million thoughts raced through her mind. She had no idea what she would find when she reached Denver, but at least she was taking a chance and not just accepting defeat in New York. I'll see you in the morning then? Indeed you will. Rest well. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Mrs. Gardner left, leaving the letters behind. Molly read them again, and this time she felt a slight flicker of hope dawn in her heart. She'd had no hope for a very long time. She unrolled her bedroll and lay down. As she waited for sleep to come, she tried to imagine what Howard would look like. She thought of his sister, Rose, and wondered if they would be friends. For the first time in years, Molly fell asleep with a smile on her face and a light heart. Chapter 11. By the time the train pulled out of the station in New York, Molly hadn't yet caught her breath. Mrs. Gardner had knocked on her door early the morning before, ready to start a day of shopping and packing. Molly had never had money to spend on herself, and she had to push away the guilt of spending a stranger's money. Between her and Mrs. Gardner, they knew where to find everything she needed for the journey at the lowest prices. She had money left over once all the necessities were bought, and Molly tucked it into her purse to return to Howard Grover when they met, but Mrs. Gardner insisted she buy new clothes instead. Molly hesitated, but when Mrs. Gardner cocked a brow, she had abided. You can't expect a man like Howard Grover to welcome you into his home wearing those threadbare dresses. Sarah's gifted dress remained packed in her hope chest, but she couldn't imagine traveling in that during the day. She followed Mrs. Gardner down a lane, into an alley, and onward into a dress shop. Molly had spent most of her life wearing secondhand clothes, shopping only at those secondhand outfitters that littered the Lower East Side when she was in dire need of updated threads. For the first time in her life, she stepped into a garment shop. Her jaw almost dropped at the beautiful dresses, shoes, and hats on display. I can't afford these, she had whispered to Mrs. Gardner, who simply shook her head. Yes, you can. Howard Grover sent that money for a reason, and we saved so much that you deserve to buy a few new things. Molly shook her head when a pale green dress caught her eye. As if entranced, she walked towards the dress and carefully inspected the fabric. It's beautiful. Mrs. Gardner chuckled behind her. You can afford two just like it. Molly turned to Mrs. Gardner with a surprised look. I have that much money left? Yes, my dear. You have enough for new undergarments, too. Shouldn't I rather pay the rent? Molly asked, not taking her eyes off the dress. Why? You're leaving tomorrow. Do this for yourself, Molly. You deserve to spoil yourself, heaven knows, after everything you've been through. Molly debated for a moment before she nodded. After fitting a good few dresses, she finally found two she simply adored. She bought both dresses as well as new undergarments. The shop owner, clearly grateful for the business, offered Molly a bottle of scent as a gift. Tentatively, she had opened the scent bottle and a smile curved her mouth. "It smells like flowers?" "It's French, a little watered down, of course, but French." Molly closed it and placed it in her reticule, not wanting to waste any. They left the garment shop and Mrs. Gardner surprised her with a beautiful blush-pink bonnet. Molly tried to refuse, but Mrs. Gardner insisted that she would need it for her new life. The rest of the evening was spent packing all she owned into the hope chest that once held only her most prized possessions. She left a letter for the landlord and asked Mrs. Gardner to take whatever she couldn't take with her. By the time Molly crawled onto her bedroll, she was spent. She woke up early in the morning, washed and dressed for the journey eastward. Mrs. Gardner and her husband had taken Molly to the station, and after a tearful goodbye, Molly handed her ticket to the conductor. As the train gained speed, leaving New York behind, Molly felt a tight bundle of nerves coil in her tummy. She hadn't once stopped to consider whether heading to Colorado was the right move. But a glance out the window at the gray, rainy day made her realize she didn't really have a choice. Mrs. Gardner was right. At least she would have food and shelter. She couldn't say the same if she stayed in New York. She opened her new reticule to remove Howard's letter, and something dropped into her lap. A frown creased Molly's brow as she picked up the slip of paper. A smile spread across her face, even as a tear slipped over her cheek. Mrs. Gardner had somehow slipped her biscuit recipe into her reticule when she wasn't looking. She hugged the recipe to her chest and vowed to write to Mrs. Gardner once she was settled. She couldn't remember how many times Mrs. Gardner's biscuits had filled a hole her parents' budget could not. Mrs. Gardner's biscuits had been a treat her parents couldn't afford, and she would always remember them from her time in New York. Over the coming days, Molly spent most of her time gazing out the window at the changing landscape as they crossed through the country heading west. When she wasn't looking out the window, she was reading Howard's letters over and over again. Every time she would pick up something new that colored the image she had of him a little more. By the time the train crossed into Colorado, Molly couldn't help but be excited to meet the kind man portrayed in the letters. With New York days behind her, she felt as if she could breathe for the first time in months. She didn't know what awaited her in Colorado, but she had a feeling it wouldn't be a bedroll and a dank one-roomed apartment. She glanced out the window and thought of her parents. Would they have been proud of her for taking this chance, or would they have cautioned her against it? She debated for a few moments before deciding they would have supported her. They had left England in search of a better life. They wouldn't blame Molly for doing the same. Her heart clenched, realizing that she wouldn't be able to visit their graves again. After dabbing the tears away with her handkerchief, she opened Howard's last letter and read it again. She wasn't looking for a life of wealth and comfort. All she wanted was a kind man and a humble life that did not have her going to bed hungry. Howard Grover offered her exactly that. For a moment, her nerves began to frazzle. What if he didn't like her? The doubts washed over her mind like a tidal wave. She felt her breath start to come in short, ragged drags and felt as if she might faint. Suddenly, the reality of what she had done hit with a loud thump. Molly glanced around the train, her eyes filled with fear as she thought of all that might go wrong. The train whistled, startling her into gasping for air. Molly glanced out the window as she managed to catch her breath. A frown etched her brow when she noticed the sign hanging over the station platform. They had arrived in Denver, Colorado. There was no time now for a change of mind. She had arrived, and she had no choice but to get off the train and meet Howard Grover. Chapter 12, Colorado, 1st December 1876. Molly stepped off the train, and for a moment the cold stole her breath. Denver looked nothing like New York. There were buildings, but they weren't up against each other. Beyond the buildings were only wide-open plains. Large mountains created a beautiful backdrop to the snowy landscape. It was the most beautiful place Molly had ever seen. People rushed by her, eager to welcome weary travelers, but Molly didn't move. She tried to remember what Howard had said he'd wear in his letters, but she couldn't remember a single word. A man tapped her shoulder and she turned around. "Your chest, miss?" a young man asked with a cocked brow. Molly nodded, glancing at her hope chest before resuming her search through the myriad of people on the platform. After almost a week on the train, the cold nipped at her fingers and toes. She could feel her nose tingle from the cold air as a shiver passed down her spine. A group of people moved then to reveal a man standing to one side of the platform. He was at least 6 inches taller than Molly. His hair was brown beneath his cowboy hat, but his eyes were the lightest blue Molly had ever seen. She couldn't seem to drag her gaze away from him when she suddenly realized he was walking directly towards her. Her breath caught as he stopped in front of her with a charming smile. His teeth were straight and a pearly white as the smile broadened. "Miss Gray?" he asked, taking off his hat. Molly nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by his attractive appearance. "Howard Grover, I'm glad you came. For a moment I wasn't sure you would." He reached for her wrist and gently pressed a kiss to her gloved hand. Molly felt a flush cover her cheeks as a smile curved her mouth. "I wasn't sure I would either," she admitted hesitantly. He chuckled softly and searched her face. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Molly." Molly nodded, still unable to believe the man Mrs. Gardner had found for her through a paper advertisement had made her head spin with a single smile. "It's nice to meet you, too. Please meet my sister, Rose." Until that moment, Molly had not even noticed the person accompanying him. She turned to his sister, surprised to find her just as breathtaking. She had light blonde hair, almost the color of butter, all intricately braided with ribbons. Her eyes were the same light blue as Howard's, but with almost a navy edge. "It's nice to meet you, Rose," Molly managed with a smile. Rose laughed. "You must be tired from traveling. Howard, get her chest so we can get her home." Molly smiled gratefully as she followed Rose to a wagon. "How long is the journey from Denver?" "About an hour if the weather is good. Otherwise it can take as long as 3 hours." Mortified at spending 3 hours in a wagon, Molly prayed for amenable weather. She watched as Howard lifted her hope chest onto the back as if it weighed nothing at all before he walked to her. "Let me help you." He held out his hand, and Molly accepted it as she climbed into the wagon. Howard took his place on her one side with Rose on her other. "How was the journey?" Howard asked as they rode out of Denver. "Long," Molly said with a sigh before she smiled at the scenery around her. "It's beautiful here." "It is," Rose agreed. "I don't think there's a place like it anywhere in the world. You should see our cabin." Molly nodded, eager to hear about her new home. "It's not much, but it has 2 bedrooms. The kitchen is rather small, but the benefit of a small house is that it heats easily in winter." Molly smiled. "I know what you mean. Your home sounds very nice. You mentioned you lived on a ranch. Do you have horses or cattle?" Howard turned to her with a nod. "Yes, you sent. We have both. We use the horses to herd the cattle. Our herd is still small, only 20 head, but I'm positive that it will grow in the coming years." "I know nothing about ranching, but I'm sure, like anything in life, it takes time." Rose laughed. "Howard, she knows more than I do about ranching already." Molly smiled at Rose, already feeling a kinship with her. She couldn't help but wonder when Howard might decide about the wedding. The letter had mentioned getting acquainted first. But now, sitting in the wagon with Howard and his sister, Molly, couldn't help but wonder if he had any intention of marrying her whatsoever. A frown creased her brow as she thought of all the horrible scenarios she imagined might happen when she arrived in Colorado. "I hope you don't mind us heading to the ranch straight away. I've heard there might be a blizzard later this afternoon." "I was hoping to get us home before it strikes," Howard explained, glancing at her. Molly nodded, and before she could stop herself, the words tumbled from her lips. "Are we to be married?" Rose chuckled even as Howard's mouth tugged into a grin. "If we get along, we sure are. I just thought you might want to get to know me first. You don't have to worry about propriety until then. You'll be sharing a room with Rose until our wedding." Molly let out the breath she didn't even know she had been holding. "Good." "Why didn't you tell me how pretty you are?" Howard asked, turning to her. A blush colored Molly's cheeks. "I'm not pretty," she argued. No one had ever called her pretty before. Most people had teased her about her flaming red hair, and others had cursed her sea-green eyes, but pretty had never entered the equation. Howard's laughter rumbled, but instead of setting Molly on edge, it teased a smile from her. "You are pretty much the most beautiful woman I've ever met, Miss Molly Gray," Howard said confidently as he looked at her. Molly turned to Rose for help, but Rose simply shrugged. "Howard's right, Molly. You are very pretty. I've never met anyone with flaming hair before. I got it from my mother's side. She was Irish. And here I thought only whiskey came from Ireland," Howard teased. Molly didn't imagine feeling at ease with Howard so soon after meeting him, but she did. He was exactly like the man he portrayed to be in the letters. They rode in silence for a long while. Rose finally broke the silence. "Can you cook, Molly?" Molly nodded. "If I have the right ingredients, yes." "Great, because I'm a horrible cook," Howard laughed. "Rose, you're a horrible cook and even worse at cleaning. We still have to find out what you're good at. Maybe sewing? Or laundry?" Molly offered, earning a cringe from Rose. "I'm very good at reading," Rose offered hopefully, making Molly smile. "Then you can read me a story while I cook," Molly teased. By the time they turned onto a smaller road, Molly's seat was numb from the rocking of the wagon. She shifted a little and accidentally brushed an arm against Howard. He didn't say a word, but when he turned to look at her with a warm smile, the flush of heat that raced through her body was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She returned the smile, fascinated by the man who would probably have the women trailing after him all the way from Denver, but had instead chosen to find a mail-order bride. She felt Rose's head fall against her shoulder and peeked to find Rose fast asleep. Howard chuckled. "She always falls asleep in the wagon. Heaven only knows why she insists on coming with." Molly smiled and decided now was the time to ask Howard all the questions she had thought of on the train. "Would you mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Prosody rate percent?" Howard nodded, keeping his gaze on the road. "Go ahead. How old are you?" Howard looked at her with a cheeky grin. "Were you hoping for a younger fella?" No, of course not," Molly quickly said. "I just thought you'd be older, actually." Howard laughed. "I'm 30 years of age this year, and Rose is 28. 28? Molly repeated, confused as to why Rose wasn't married yet. "Yes, she married when she was young, but after only 2 years of marriage, her husband died of fever. She hasn't considered remarrying since then." "That must have been awful for her," Molly sympathized. "It was, but she moved back home and we've been looking out for each other ever since." Molly smiled. It wasn't every man that would take care of his grown sister. "Any other questions?" Howard asked. Molly sighed. "I know this might sound strange, but why me?" Howard pulled on the reins, stopping the wagon before he turned to Molly. "Because I liked your letters. You seem like a hard-working woman who's had enough hardship for more than one lifetime. And besides, I was curious to see what a red head looked like." When he winked, Molly laughed. Maybe things were as simple as they appeared. Howard was looking for a wife who was hardworking to help him on his ranch, and there were no hidden agendas. "I take it ranching is a lot of work?" "Yup, ma'am. Most work you'll ever do. Some days are long and some days never end, but it's rewarding knowing we're making something of God's country for ourselves. Living off the land, so to speak. Do you know how to grow vegetables?" Molly shook her head. "No, but I can sew and do laundry and I can bake and I don't mind helping on the ranch." Howard smiled, but this time it was warm and tender. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I have a feeling you're not going back to New York. Not just yet anyway." The way he said it made Molly smile. She had only known Howard for a little more than an hour, but she also couldn't imagine going back to New York. After another hour, the wagon passed under a wooden sign that read Iron Mountain. Molly was captivated by the cattle alongside the road. Howard had mentioned the ranch being small, but she couldn't help but be curious about the size of the ranch they now traveled through. "This is a big ranch." "Yes, some," Howard agreed. "Biggest ranch in 3 counties. Unfortunately, there is no road from the road to my ranch. We have to pass through Iron Mountain Ranch first." He navigated the wagon over a small stream before turning in the other direction. As far as the eye could see, not a building was in sight. It was beautiful and at the same time solitary, Molly thought, taking in her surroundings. Snow lay like a thick white blanket over the hills, also dusting the trees with a light coat. When Howard finally turned the wagon again, she saw a small cabin in the distance. It was small and a little run down, but Molly didn't care. It was bigger than the one room she had lived in for most of her life. When Howard stopped the wagon in front of the porch, Molly turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Howard, this is beautiful." Howard frowned before he shrugged. "It's home." Howard climbed down and offered his hand to Molly after she had woken Rose. His hand was big and warm over hers, Molly thought, as she climbed down. She turned to look at the cabin, which was a little worse for wear. Panels needed replacing, and the rocking chair on the porch had seen better days. But that wasn't what Molly saw. Molly saw a new beginning, and the plans God had for her all along. Plans for a future and new hope. It's Juan. Her heart swelled in her chest, and tears burned her eyes when she heard Howard's boots crunch in the snow behind her. "Come on, let's get inside. Hopefully it's still warm." Molly nodded and blinked the tears away. Tonight she would not go to bed hungry or cold. Tonight she would go to sleep in her new home, and if she was lucky, it might just be her home forever. Chapter 13. Molly woke up the following morning after a good night's rest. After their arrival at the cabin the night before, Howard had shown her to the room she would share with Rose, before showing her around the barn and the cabin. It was a humble home compared to the Iron Mountain's large farmhouse, but Molly loved every inch of it. She had helped Rose cook a hearty stew for dinner, and they had sat around the fireplace drinking coffee and talking late into the night. By the time Molly retired for the night, she was tired and happier than she imagined she would be. Howard was a kind and humble man. His ranch might be small, but she could hear the pride in his voice when he spoke of it. He had offered to do the dishes and had thanked Molly again for coming. Whenever their eyes met, Molly felt a sense of home. It had felt strange at first because Molly had never thought of home as anywhere but New York. But when she looked into Howard's face, it felt right to be in Colorado with him. Although Rose was older than her, they got along as if they had been friends forever. Where Molly had dreaded each new day in New York, she greeted the morning with hope and a renewed will to live life to the fullest. She pulled a new dress on and made her bed before heading to the kitchen to find Howard already sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Molly. Would you like some coffee?" Molly smiled. "Good morning, Howard. I'd appreciate it." He poured her a cup and brought it to the table before sitting down again. "I hope you slept well." "I did, like a log." Molly took a sip of the strong brew and glanced out the window to see snow falling in heavy drifts. In New York, snow had lost its magic for her, but sitting in the warm cabin with Howard, it seemed almost magical again. "Is there anything you'd like me to do today?" Howard frowned and tilted his head. "Like what? I don't know." "Chores around the barn. What needs to be done?" Howard chuckled. "I'm not letting you catch your death out in the snow. You can stay inside today. I'll do what needs to be done." Molly nodded. "I really don't mind." "I believe you," Howard said as if it surprised him. "I need to check on a heifer in the barn. I'll be back again soon." Molly smiled and watched him leave. After finishing her coffee, she placed more logs on the fire before returning to the kitchen. She found flour and ham in the cold box. For a moment, she wondered if she was allowed to use either and decided Howard wouldn't mind a hearty breakfast. It felt so good to be able to cook again. For so long, she had lived off bread and perhaps a thin broth on some days to stretch her groceries. By the time the door opened again and Howard stepped inside, shaking the snow off his shoulders, the aroma of ham grilling and freshly baked biscuits filled the air. "You cooked breakfast?" Howard asked. Molly dropped the skillet on the stove and turned to him with a wide-eyed expression. "I didn't think you'd mind. Am I in trouble?" Howard's mouth quirked into a grin. "Molly, why would I mind? Rose has never been able to make biscuits. Those are biscuits I smell, right?" Molly nodded, her racing heart beginning to settle again. For a moment, she thought Howard might be angry. "Yes, biscuits. My mother taught me how to make them when I was small. I haven't made them in a while." She trailed off. too ashamed to admit that she had not been able to afford flour. "I'm sure they'll taste just fine. I'll set the table and brew us fresh coffee," Howard said, moving into the kitchen area. Whenever their arms touched or their gazes met, Molly felt her heart skip a beat. Rose eventually walked into the kitchen in her nightclothes and cocked a brow at the homely sight. "Well, you two seem to get along just fine." Molly suppressed a smile, but Howard chuckled. "You seem to still be asleep. Coffee? I'd love some." "Thank you." Rose took a seat at the table, and Molly began serving the ham, eggs, and biscuits. Once everyone had taken their seats, Howard held out his hands. "Let us say grace." Molly closed her eyes and listened to his humble prayer. "Dear Lord, thank you for every blessing you have bestowed upon us. Thank you for bringing Molly to us safely and for the food she has cooked for us. Bless us, Lord, and keep us during this day. Amen." Molly felt his hand squeeze hers lightly and met his gaze. For a moment the world disappeared, and all that existed was her and Howard. She hadn't known what to expect, but she didn't expect to like her future husband this much. She couldn't wait to write to Mrs. Gardner and tell her all about her new life. Once breakfast was finished, Howard told Rose to do the dishes and invited Molly to sit with him by the fire. The dishes clattered in the basin as Rose worked, startling Molly. When Rose finally joined them, she had changed into a pretty dress that was clearly thick and very warm. Molly glanced down at the floor, noticing how the wooden boards were scuffed and quite dirty. She wondered why Rose hadn't cleaned it in a while, but didn't comment. Instead, she turned to her hosts with a smile. "Would you mind if I did some cleaning today?" Rose nodded eagerly. "Please do. I can't seem to get ahead with keeping this cabin." Howard cocked a brow before smiling at Molly. "Molly, I want you to treat this cabin as your home. Please don't feel you have to ask for permission." Molly nodded, wondering what Howard and Rose would be doing. As if answering her thoughts, Howard stood up and pulled on his coat. "Word was sent this morning that they need help over at the Iron Mountain today, moving the herd." Rose yawned, clearly bored with the subject, and Molly turned to Howard. "You work there as well as on your own ranch?" Howard nodded. "Ranching can have good months and bad ones. It's always good if you can get a little extra work to save for them bad months." Molly smiled. Of course. It wasn't much different to her taking in laundry while also working two jobs. Howard left, and Molly stood up to go in search of a bucket. She found one on the porch and headed to the water pump she had seen Howard use the day before. With the bucket filled, she headed back inside and found the scrubbing brush. She glanced down at her new dress, knowing she couldn't ruin it with scrubbing floors. After changing into an old dress, she set to work. She started with the area in front of the fireplace, moving the chairs and furniture aside before getting down on all fours and scrubbing away. While scrubbing, she noticed Rose attempting fairly unsuccessfully to dust the cobwebs. A frown creased Molly's brow, but she didn't comment on how strange she found it that Rose knew so little about cooking or housework. She didn't seem lazy, just as if she didn't know what needed to be done. For a 28-year-old woman who had been married, it was quite strange. When Molly had finished scrubbing the entire cabin except for Howard's bedroom, it was already late afternoon. Her back was a little sore and her arm had a twinge, but it was nothing compared to hauling trays in and out of the large oven at the bakery in New York. She changed into her nice dress again and found Rose in the kitchen pondering dinner. "Would you like me to make dinner?" Molly offered. Rose turned to her with a grateful smile. "I'd appreciate it. I'm all out of ideas. Prosody." Molly smiled and glanced at the groceries in the cupboard. Although dried goods were not abundant, there was enough to make a pretty decent meal. An idea formed in her mind as she checked for the ingredients she needed before she set to work. When Howard arrived home a little while later, the meat pie was in the oven and the vegetables already made. Rose welcomed him with a big smile. "She sure can cook, Howard." Howard smiled at Molly and nodded. "Better watch my waistline once I'm married, or I'll have a paunch before we have our first young gun." Molly's heart stopped at the mention of marriage and children, and then a slow smile curved her mouth. She wouldn't mind marrying the handsome man teasing her. To be honest, she wouldn't mind spending the rest of her life with him. Don't think you'll eat like this every day, Buster. I just felt sorry for you going all the way to the Iron Mountain Ranch to work today. Howard and Rose shared a look before Howard turned to Molly. I appreciate you thinking of me. Molly nodded as her heart warmed at his smile. It might just be a day since her arrival in Colorado, but Molly already had a feeling that she was going to live a long and happy life with Howard on their little ranch. Chapter 14. A week after her arrival in Colorado, Molly had settled in better than expected. She had fallen into a routine of cooking breakfast and dinner, with lunch being a help-yourselves-to-leftovers or a sandwich. She baked a fresh loaf of bread every second day and had managed to clean the cabin, which was now spotless. Rose slept late most mornings but helped whenever Molly asked, although she needed a great deal of guidance. Howard hadn't worked at the Iron Mountain Ranch again, but he did work his ranch every day. In the evenings after dinner, Rose retired to her room to read, and Molly and Howard would sit by the fire and talk for hours. She had learned so much about him, and yet she couldn't wait to learn even more. Over the course of the past few days, she had noticed men arriving on horseback to see Howard. She was never privy to their conversations, and finally couldn't hold her curiosity any longer. Rose was reading by the fireside when Molly approached her. Who are all these men coming to see Howard? Heaven knows, I think I see 2 to 3 arriving every day. Rose shrugged and closed her book. Most of them work up at the Iron Mountain Ranch. They come to Howard for advice. Why? Molly asked, confused. Howard knows more about cattle than most everyone I've met. He knows about keeping the coyotes away and how to keep a mountain lion from picking off his herd. He's a kind man and doesn't mind sharing his knowledge. Molly nodded, her respect for Howard only increasing. He was a humble rancher with a small ranch, yet the biggest ranch in the county sent men to him for advice. A smile curved her mouth in pride as she returned to the kitchen to finish baking the biscuits using Mrs. Gardner's recipe. When Howard returned to the cabin later that afternoon, it was to warm biscuits and fresh milk. Molly had milked the cow earlier that day and was becoming quite the adept milkmaid by all accounts. She had never thought she'd enjoy working with farm animals, but she and Daisy, the milk cow, had become good friends. She was still careful to collect eggs from the chicken coop inside the barn, but she loved having a constant supply of the newly laid eggs. These biscuits are delicious, Howard said, impressed, as he reached for another. Molly remembered the biscuit she had put in her mother's grave, and a wave of sadness overwhelmed her. Before she knew it, Howard was by her side, his hands on her shoulders. Molly, what on earth is wrong? You look like you've just seen a ghost. Molly turned to him with a watery gaze. I just remembered something, that's all. Well, tell me. If it can drain the blood from your face, I'd like to know what it is. Molly had never told anyone about the biscuits or how hungry she had been, but looking into Howard's blue eyes, she knew he deserved to know about her past if he was going to be her future. She took a deep breath as she sat down at the table. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze on the plate of biscuits as she told Howard about the biscuits and how Mrs. Gardner had given her the recipe. She didn't mention that Mrs. Gardner had been the one who had initiated writing to him, afraid to possibly dissolve the trust they had built. Howard listened and reached for her hand when she spoke of tossing the biscuit into her mother's grave. Molly, I might not be able to offer fancy clothes and many luxuries, but you'll never go hungry again. I promise you that. Molly felt a tear slip over her cheek, and Howard's finger gently brushed it away. When she looked into his eyes, she saw more than sympathy. She recognized the look of a man who kept his word. Thank you, Howard. Come on, why don't we have a cup of coffee on the porch? Rose can burn dinner again. Percent. Rose complained from beside the fireplace, but Molly smiled. She's getting better. We'll see. Howard grabbed a blanket from the chair at the fireplace and led her onto the porch. It was cold, but it was so beautiful that Molly didn't mind. Howard draped the blanket over her shoulders and took a seat beside her. When I read your letters, I thought you were too good to be true, but after just 1 week, I have a feeling you didn't lie about a single thing. Molly sighed. grateful that Mrs. Gardner hadn't portrayed her as someone she wasn't. I thought you might have been lying as well. Howard shook his head and smiled at her. What do you say we go to town tomorrow? Molly's eyes widened with horror. Was he sending her back already? A chuckle escaped him as he shook his head. I didn't mean Denver, first of all. And secondly, I'm not sending you home, Molly Gray. I meant Chancer's Creek. It's a small town just 30 minutes from here. I'm sure the pantry must be growing empty, and I need a few things before Christmas. And Rose? Molly asked when her heart finally quietened. Rose doesn't enjoy going to town. She can keep the cabin warm and read her book. Molly chuckled. I've never met anyone who reads quite as much as she does. She's always been that way. Her nose in a book and her head in the clouds, Howard said affectionately. Molly turned to him with a frown. How have you always been? Howard laughed. Now that's a question for you. I've always loved the land. Ever since my pa first took to me to rope a steer, I knew I belonged on a horse racing after cattle. I don't think I can be any other way. Molly smiled, her heart warming at the thought of Howard as a little boy. You must have been very brave. Not as brave as you were coming out here to meet me. He lifted her hand and pressed a chaste kiss to it. You fascinate me, and I'm not easily intrigued. Molly laughed, her heart floating on a wave of love and happiness. Howard had a way of speaking out at the most unexpected times that made her head spin. She wasn't sure what it felt like to fall in love, but she had a pretty good feeling that when your head spun in circles and your heart bounced out of her chest, you were getting pretty close. Chapter 15. The following morning, Molly was brimming with excitement. She couldn't wait to see the town. She didn't know about Howard's budget for groceries, but took the liberty of making a list of all she would need and another of what would be nice to have. When Howard joined her in the kitchen after morning chores, she was ready to leave. The wagon's waiting, Howard said before a smile curved his mouth. Why, Molly? You look simply breathtaking. Molly blushed, glancing down at the dress she had bought in New York. The pale green wonder hugged her bodice, billowing from her waist. Thank you, although I must admit that I wish I brought a thicker coat. Rose, Howard called out. Rose came out of her room, awake but still in her nightclothes. What is it? I planned on lying in since I have the cabin to myself. You can lie in a minute. Can Molly borrow your coat? Rose frowned at Molly's thin coat and nodded. Please do. I didn't notice how thin yours was. She disappeared into the room and came back with a thick woolen coat. Here you go. Molly slipped it on, the warmth hugging her like a blanket. Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you, Rose. My pleasure, Rose smiled warmly. Enjoy your day in town. Bring me something nice. Molly laughed at Howard's frown as they headed to the wagon. Howard told her how the landscape would change in summer as they drove. When the large Iron Mountain ranch house came into view, Molly sighed. It must be nice living in a house that big, she commented almost to herself. Howard shrugged. Drafty, I'd imagine. Molly chuckled. You're right. Besides, your cabin is perfect and cozy. Our cabin, Howard corrected with a smile. What's mine is yours, Molly. It might not be much, but it's ours. Molly smiled as the wagon climbed a small hill before it lowered into a town. The town was much smaller than Denver, and people waved at Howard as they drove. Molly could tell Howard was liked by almost everyone he knew, judging by the warm smiles that accompanied the waves. When Howard stopped in front of the general merchandiser, he turned to Molly. I have an errand to run, and I have to stop by the feed store. Can you manage buying the supplies? Molly nodded as Howard handed her a few bills. Howard, this is too much, Molly said, glancing at the money in her hand. I saved for Christmas. Christmas is a time for being a little extravagant. Molly nodded, grateful that she could buy everything on her list. She went into the store and gathered whatever she needed. She remembered Rose's request and added a few boiled sweets to her purchases. When she reached the wagon, Howard was just coming down the thoroughfare with a box in hand. All done? Howard nodded as he climbed into the wagon. Molly handed him the change with a warm smile. Save this. We don't want to spend it all in one day. Howard frowned, but pocketed the change before taking the reins. As they drove back to the cabin, Molly thought of Christmas for the first time since her arrival. Christmas had always brought her nothing but loneliness and loss. She couldn't imagine this year would be different, but with Howard at her side, it was almost guaranteed. A smile curved the corners of her mouth as she wondered what she could give him for Christmas. She had no money, but she could make him something. Howard was lost in his own thoughts during the drive home. By the time they arrived at the cabin, Molly knew exactly what she wanted to make Howard. She had brought a small piece of fabric from New York to make herself a new handkerchief. Hers was still serviceable, but she didn't know if Howard had one. Satisfied with her idea, she headed to her hope chest after packing the day's purchases in the cupboard. She found a roll of dark blue cotton thread her mother had always used to sew handkerchiefs for her father. Molly tugged her bottom lip between her teeth, eager to get started. She would make him a handkerchief and embroider his initials in the corner. It was a humble gift for a humble man, a gift she knew he would appreciate. Chapter 16. Colorado, 15th of December, 1876. Teward had to put in a day's work at the Iron Mountain Ranch and left early that morning. Molly was grateful for the reprieve, not because she didn't enjoy his company, but because she needed the time to sew his handkerchief. After breakfast and morning chores, she joined Rose beside the fire. Over the last few days, Rose had been a great help with cleaning the cabin. It seemed all she needed was someone steering her in the right direction. "What have you got there?" Rose asked when Molly took out the cotton thread and the piece of white cotton fabric. Molly smiled at Rose. "I want to make Howard a gift for Christmas. I noticed he doesn't have a handkerchief, at least not one I've seen." Rose's eyes widened. "You're going to sew him a gift for Christmas?" Molly nodded. "Yes. Why do you seem so surprised? Don't you give gifts at Christmas time?" Rose smiled kindly. "We do." She glanced at the fire before turning to Molly. "You know what, Molly? I didn't hold much hope that Howard's mail-order bride idea would work. I thought it a foolish plan made by a foolish man, but my brother struck gold when he wrote to you." Molly couldn't stop the blush from heating her cheeks or her heart from swelling at the compliment. "Thank you, Rose." They shared a warm smile before each turned to their own tasks. Molly didn't rush stitching the handkerchief. Instead, she took her time intricately stitching and edging. With the edges finally done, she began with the monogram. Every now and then, Rose would walk over to see how she was faring before making them a fresh round of tea. It was pleasant to sit by the fire and spend time with Rose, but when the afternoon rolled around, Molly began to miss Howard. She knew he would probably only return early that evening, but she hoped he would come home sooner. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, she heard the wagon arrive. A frown creased her brow as she stood up and walked to the window. Howard usually rode his horse to Iron Mountain. A smile curved her mouth when she saw the wagon and the large pine tree it bore. "Rose, come look. Howard brought a tree," Molly called out excitedly as she rushed out of the cabin towards the wagon. "Hello, Molly," Howard called out brightly. "I brought us a Christmas tree to decorate." A frown creased Molly's brow as her heart swelled with affection. She had never had a Christmas tree before. She only saw them in the windows of the wealthy homes in New York. No one in her tenement could have afforded such frivolity. "Howard, that tree is much too big for the cabin," Rose called out from the porch before she joined them. "Well, are you going to stand there gaping, or are you going to help me get it inside? I thought we could put it beside the fireplace." Molly nodded, swallowing back the overwhelming emotions. She couldn't remember a Christmas in which she had shared in the festive spirit, but it was clear this Christmas was turning out to be better than she had imagined. After some tugging and a little struggle, they managed to set the tree beside the fireplace. It towered to the roof, both magnificent and enchanting. "I think I have some ribbons," Rose said, rushing to her room. She returned a few minutes later with a tin filled with ribbons, very much like the ribbons Molly had once sold on the icy streets. She pushed away the sad memories and her questions of how Rose had come to own such beautiful ribbons and joined Rose beside the fire. Together they decorated the tree until the whole cabin seemed festive with its presence. When it was finally done, Molly stood back and smiled. "It's beautiful." Howard moved to her side. "I thought you might appreciate it." Molly turned to him and met his blue eyes. "Howard, it means the world that you brought it home." "Coffee, anyone?" Rose asked while moving to the kitchen. Howard nodded but didn't look away from Molly's face. "I never thought it would make me happy to see someone happy, but it does." Molly smiled and shrugged. "I'm very happy and grateful. One day I will admit just how much this means to me, but not today." She smiled and blinked away the tears of happiness. "Come, let's have that coffee." Howard smiled and reached for Molly's hand. "One day we'll tell each other everything." Molly frowned, wondering what he had to tell her, but she didn't question him. They moved to the kitchen where Rose had just poured them coffee. "Would you mind if I cooked tonight, Molly?" Rose asked. Molly couldn't help but be confused by her question. "Rose, it's your cabin as well. You don't have to ask permission to cook." Rose shrugged. "I know you enjoy it, but I thought you deserved the evening off. Why don't you join Howard at the fireside while I figure out how not to burn dinner?" Howard and Molly laughed as they moved to the fireplace. Molly glanced at his handsome profile and hoped they would be married soon. She had fallen in love with him and couldn't wait to spend the rest of her life with him. Chapter 17. Every so often, a clatter came from the direction of the kitchen, but Molly and Howard ignored it as they sat together beside the fire. Howard was suddenly quiet, and Molly wished to know what was on his mind. After a while, he turned to her with a hopeful look. "I know I've asked for your hand, Molly, but I feel now that we know each other, I'd like to ask again. Would you spend the rest of your life with me?" Molly's heart swelled as a smile curved her mouth. "Howard, I'd be honored to share my life with you." Howard looked relieved as a grin tugged at the corners of his mouth. "For a moment, I wasn't sure you'd want to stay." "Why? Because the cabin is a little run down, or because the ranch is small? None of that matters. All that matters is that we're together. We have shelter, we have food, and we have—" Molly trailed off, afraid to say the word that had been on her mind all day. "Love?" Howard asked. Molly nodded shyly. "Yes." His smile broadened. "Yes, we do." He glanced at the fire before turning back to Molly. "I was thinking we can ask the preacher to marry us on Christmas Eve. I know it's not traditional, but I'd like us to spend our first Christmas together as husband and wife." Molly's eyes widened. Christmas Eve held nothing but sad pasts for her. She couldn't imagine getting married on the saddest day of the year. She glanced down at the floor as a tear slipped over her cheek. "Molly?" Howard asked, reaching for her hand. "What is it? Don't you want to get married?" Molly shook her head, still not meeting his gaze. "I'd love to marry you, but not on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve holds nothing but sadness for me." She hesitated for a moment before meeting his questioning gaze. Taking a deep breath, she told Howard about her mother and how she had died. She continued to regale how she had lost her father a few years later and finished the story with Sarah's father. "As you can see, Christmas Eve truly is a day of sad memories for me." Howard squeezed her hand. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you, to lose your mother on a day meant for love and happiness and family." Molly nodded. "I'm sorry to disappoint you." Howard smiled and shook his head. "You'll never disappoint me, but I still think we should get married on Christmas Eve. You're starting a new life here. Don't you think it will help to have a happy memory to replace all the bad ones?" Molly frowned, considering his words. Perhaps it was time she wiped her slate clean of all the terrible memories of lonely and hungry Christmases. Maybe it was time to look to the future with Howard at her side instead of remembering her bleak past. She turned to Howard with a hopeful smile. "I'd like that." Howard all but beamed. "Rose, we're getting married on Christmas Eve." Rose dropped the skillet before she rushed to Molly. "I'm so happy for you. We'll be sisters." Molly laughed. "As long as we can be friends as well." "We'll always be friends." "Good, then I'll ride into town tomorrow to arrange for the preacher and the chapel," Howard said happily. Molly nodded as excitement started to build. By Christmas, she would be a married woman. She would make sure Christmas was a special day with a feast for dinner and only happiness and love all around them. "I'm so happy," Molly said almost to herself. "I didn't think I'd be happy in Colorado, but now I can't imagine never meeting you, both of you." Molly took a deep breath and walked to the Christmas tree. The scent of pine needles filled the air and almost brought tears to her eyes. How she wished her parents could have known the scent of pine needles filling the house. She brushed away the tears when she realized Howard was by her side. "I'm happy too, Molly. I'm happy because I didn't think I'd meet someone as wonderful as you. On Christmas Eve, we'll say our vows and then we'll spend every Christmas remembering how blessed we are to have found each other." Molly nodded and smiled at Howard. "Do you think Rose managed dinner?" Howard chuckled. "I'm not sure she managed, but I know she tried. Shall we see if she needs some help?" "Yes, I think we should." Molly laughed. They moved to the kitchen and were both surprised to see a stew simmering on the stove. The aroma was hearty and mouth-watering. Molly looked at Rose, impressed. "See, I told you that you could cook," Rose laughed. "Yes, you did, although I don't know that it will taste as good as it smells." "I'm sure it will," Molly assured her when she noticed a man riding up on a horse. "Who's that?" "Someone from Iron Mountain," Howard answered before grabbing his hat and coat and heading outside. Molly felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. Howard is kind to share his knowledge with them. He could have turned them away, but he never does. Rose nodded. He never will. Molly watched for a moment as Howard and the rider conversed before she turned to set the table. When Howard returned a few minutes later, the food was ready and it was time for dinner. They shared a glance across the table, and Molly's heart swelled in her chest with love. Chapter 18. Colorado, 24th of December, 1876. Molly woke up on the morning of Christmas Eve. A smile curved her mouth as soon as wakefulness pushed sleep aside. The sun was already making its slow ascent on the horizon, and snow was falling in little flurries. It was a beautiful day, Molly thought as she pushed herself up, suddenly remembering that she would become Mrs. Grover on this very day. Her heart skipped a beat as her smile broadened. She turned to see if Rose was reading or sleeping, only to find her bed empty. A frown creased Molly's brow as she dressed. Rose was never up before her. Something had to be wrong. As soon as she was dressed in an old dress, she braided her hair. She would change into a new dress for the wedding tonight, but today still held the duties of chores and preparing for their wedding feast. She stepped out of the room to find Howard waiting for her at the kitchen table. She glanced around, trying to find Rose, but Rose was nowhere in sight. "Good morning, Howard." "Good morning. Rose isn't here," Howard said, answering her unspoken question. "Where is she?" Molly asked as she helped herself to coffee. "We'll see her soon enough." Molly nodded, not wanting to question him more. She stoked the wood stove and added more logs before taking out a few eggs. Making breakfast for Howard had become a routine that she enjoyed. Every morning she would make something different, and every morning she would eagerly await his approval. She scrambled the eggs, and then she grilled a few pieces of ham. She made biscuits the day before and heated them while the ham fried. She finally plated a healthy serving for Howard and a much smaller one for herself. In the weeks since she arrived in Colorado, she had gained a little of the weight she had lost over the previous months. Carrying the plates to the table, she realized she couldn't even remember what a hunger pang felt like. She set down the plates before returning to the stove to pour coffee. She took a sip of the coffee and then realized that Howard had been as quiet as a mouse. She turned to find him looking at her. "Come sit down. There is something I need to talk to you about." Molly frowned, a feeling of trepidation making her heart hasten its rhythm. She sat down and held her breath, waiting to hear what horrid news this Christmas Eve had brought. "I'm an honest man, Molly, but I haven't been completely honest with you," Howard began with a heavy tone. Regret showed in his eyes, along with something Molly didn't completely understand. Molly's heart squeezed in her chest even as her frown deepened. "Howard? What's going on? You're frightening me." Howard smiled and reached for her hand. "There is nothing to be frightened about," Howard smiled. "Before we say our vows tonight, I have something to confess. Will you ride with me?" Molly shook her head, not understanding. Howard held her gaze. "There is just something I need to show you." "What do you need to show me?" Molly asked carefully. "You'll see," Howard said with a hint of a smile, confusing Molly even more. "Where?" "Do you trust me?" Howard asked, squeezing her hand. Molly considered his admission about not being honest, but knew that in her heart she trusted Howard with everything in her. Yes. A smile curved his mouth, making her tummy twist. Then ride with me. Molly nodded hesitantly. I just need to get my coat. I'll ready the wagon, Howard said happily. He held her gaze for a moment with a heart-stopping smile before he stood up and left the cabin. Molly couldn't help the feeling of dread that hung over her like a dark cloud as she buttoned her coat. Howard said she had nothing to fear, but history weighed heavily on her feelings. 7%. She walked out of the cabin towards the barn where Howard had just readied the wagon. She climbed on beside him and wondered where he was taking her. He whipped the reins and the horse began a slow trot, its hooves sinking into the snow, slowing its pace just a little. She didn't know if they were going to Denver or Chancer's Creek. All she knew was that anxiety was clawing at her every yard of the way. When the Iron Mountain Ranch came into view, she waited for Howard to change direction. Instead, he turned onto a path that led toward the large ranch house. A frown creased her brow, confused by what Howard wanted to show her on their neighbor's ranch. Perhaps he wanted to introduce her. A myriad of questions swam through her mind as he followed the road. The closer they got to the large house, the more impressive it was. It boasted 2 stories and was built of brick. Most of the houses she'd seen in the West were built of log, another testament to the wealth of the owner of the Iron Mountain Ranch. Its large wraparound porch hugged the entire house, and even at a distance, one could see the flower boxes and a few beautiful chairs. A sigh escaped her as they drew nearer with every second. It was the most beautiful house she'd ever seen. As she glanced around, she noticed the neatly kept fences and the horses and cattle in the demarcated paddocks. Instead of a small and weathered barn like the one on their property, the Iron Mountain Ranch had 2 big barns and a smaller building that looked like living quarters for the hands. 2 large oak trees proudly flanked the house as if guarding it. It's beautiful, Molly murmured to herself. Howard nodded. It is. Chapter 19. Molly was captivated by the beauty and wealth that surrounded her as they rode ever closer to the large and impressive building. Outside the front door stood a Christmas tree bigger than any she'd ever seen before. It was decorated with ribbons and glass baubles, little carved ornaments, and pieces of holly which Molly could not fathom how they had come by. She slowly shook her head. That tree is magnificent. She turned to look at Howard and noticed him dip his chin. Only then did she realize the many men standing alongside the road. As they neared the house, the men raised their hats. Her heart warmed to know that her husband was well liked, but it confused her a little as to why he was shown such respect as a poor neighbor. A well-built man lifted his hat and smiled at Molly. "Hello, ma'am." Molly waved back and laughed. She felt like royalty arriving at the Iron Mountain Ranch. She still didn't understand why they were there. Curiosity burned questions on her tongue, but she only asked one. "Why are we here, Howard?" Howard simply smiled at her. "You'll find out soon enough." He stopped the wagon in front of the house, and the men all dipped their heads in greeting before they turned and headed back to work. Molly was so fascinated with the beautiful brick building that she didn't even notice Howard climb down and move around the wagon to help her. He held out his hand with a smile that made her head spin. "Shall we?" Molly laughed. Howard was in such a good mood that the cloud of foreboding had somehow disappeared when she placed her hand in his and climbed down from the wagon. She turned and looked around, impressed with the large ranch and even more impressed by the number of men who worked there. She smiled at Howard, knowing that this was his dream for their small ranch. She aimed to be at his side, supporting him in every way possible to help him achieve that dream. "Ready to go inside?" Howard asked her with a glint of mischief in his expression. "Inside?" Molly asked, surprised. "I'm not dressed accordingly. Surely you don't want me to put you to shame." Howard turned to her and framed her face with his big, calloused hands. "Molly, you'll never put me to shame. You're the most wonderful woman I've ever met, and even if you're wearing filthy rags, you always will be. Come on." He took her hand and led her towards the large porch. Molly stopped for a moment, simply to admire the porch swing and the chairs. How wonderful it must be to sit on this porch and watch a thunderstorm or simply while away a hot summer's day. Not that Molly had ever had the luxury of whiling away any time, but she could dream. The door opened, and Molly's breath caught at the sight of the beautiful woman. She wore a dress reminiscent of the expensive dresses Molly had seen in the garment shop in New York, the type of dress Molly would never be able to afford. Her hair was golden and almost silken. It was braided intricately with ribbons, and she wore a fashionably small hat on her head. Her cheeks were rosy, and her skin glowed with health. Molly's eyes widened when she realized that the beautiful woman she was looking at was none other than Rose. She rushed forward. "Rose, what are you doing here? You look breathtaking," Rose chuckled. "Thank you. Flattery will get you everywhere." "Like inside, perhaps?" Howard asked from Molly's side. Confused by the reason for their visit, and even more baffled by Rose's attire and presence, Molly shook her head. "I don't understand." "You will," Rose assured her, reaching for her hand. "Come see inside." Molly glanced at Howard, who nodded for her to go ahead. She followed Rose into the house and couldn't even keep count of the number of times her breath caught. As soon as she stepped through the front door into a large foyer, she saw a large curving staircase that led to a second floor. To the left was a parlor, furnished the likes of which Molly had never seen outside of a shopfront window. A thick bearskin rug was spread on the floor in front of the fire, and Molly wished she could lie down on it. But Rose pulled her through the foyer to another section of the house. The dining room was magnificent, with a chandelier dangling from the ceiling. The table was large and shiny, the chairs comfortable and of the same expensive wood. From the dining room, Rose led her into a large kitchen where two women were hard at work. They smiled brightly when Rose and Molly stepped inside. "Well, hello, dear," the elderly lady said with a warm smile. "Later, Priscilla," Rose said kindly before she led Molly through the dining room to a room behind the stairs. It was an office and a library with more books than Molly had ever seen in one place. Molly wanted to look at the books, but Rose tugged on her hand and led her up the ornately carved staircase. Upstairs were 5 bedrooms, each more impressive than the first. 4 poster beds, expensive furniture, and the most beautiful armoires Molly had ever seen dominated the bedrooms. Each room had large windows overlooking the ranch. It was like the house of fairy tales, Molly thought as Rose led her downstairs again. Molly turned to her with a bright smile. "It's beautiful, Rose. Thank you for showing me." Rose smiled secretively. "Howard is waiting for you in the parlor." Molly frowned but walked to the parlor to find Howard standing by the fireplace. Chapter 20. "Howard," Molly asked, moving towards him, only then realizing that he had changed his clothes. What he wore reminded her of the clothes Sarah's father had worn on the eve of Sarah's wedding. A frown creased Molly's brow. "You changed?" Howard nodded with a warm smile as he walked towards Molly. "I wasn't honest with you in my letters. I don't live on the small ranch or in the decrepit cabin. This is my home." Molly's jaw dropped even as her mind grew fuzzy. She tried to catch her breath, but it was as if air escaped her. She felt her knees grow weak, just as Howard reached for her arm and helped her into an expensive-looking chair. As soon as she sat down, she felt guilty. What if she soiled the luxurious chair? "Molly, are you all right?" Howard asked, kneeling before her with concern shining in his eyes. Molly nodded and drew in a deep breath as Rose joined them. "I'm sorry. For a moment, I thought you said this was your home." Howard and Rose shared a smile before Howard nodded. "This is my house. The Iron Mountain Ranch belongs to me. The men who waved to us work for me." Molly frowned. None of this was making sense. She glanced at Rose and Howard's outfits and shook her head. "I don't understand. I don't understand any of this. Where did you get the clothes?" Rose laughed. "Molly, these are our clothes. We borrowed the clothes we wore at the cabin. This is who we really are. This is where you'll live when you're married. Tonight you'll spend your wedding night in the master suite on the Iron Mountain Ranch." "But then why?" Molly shook her head again. "Why did you lie? Why did you tell me you owned the cabin and the small ranch?" Howard closed his hand over hers. "I didn't lie about owning them. I do. The cabin is used for hunting mostly, and the small ranch is part of Iron Mountain." Rose clucked her tongue at Howard. What she means is, why you didn't tell her that you owned Iron Mountain. She turned to Molly with a warm smile. I know this is all very confusing for you. Why don't you take a minute to catch your breath and I'll ask Priscilla to bring us tea? Molly nodded, standing up and moving to the window. Suddenly it made sense that Rose didn't know much about housekeeping and cooking. She had Priscilla and household staff to take care of everything for her. Now she understood why the men kept showing up at the cabin to talk to Howard. Clearly they came for instructions rather than for neighborly advice. She felt betrayed, but she couldn't seem to find anger in her heart. She glanced around and noticed the crown molding on the ceiling and sighed. Howard was never poor. All this time he was richer than anyone she had ever met. She remembered the day in Chancer's Creek when some men had talked about how large the herd was at the Iron Mountain Ranch. Howard was the richest man in Colorado, and she was about to marry him. Here you are, Rose said when she returned with a tray of tea and sugar cubes. Molly turned and looked at the tray. Instead of the chipped and tin cups they had used in the cabin, these cups looked like porcelain with small painted roses on the sides, edged with gold ribbon. She watched as Rose poured her tea, and then she felt Howard's hand on her shoulder. I know this must be a shock. Molly nodded, accepting the tea. She carefully took a sip, afraid to break the cup before she turned to Rose. So why the deceit? Rose and Howard shared a look before Rose began. Our father started Iron Mountain almost 50 years ago. Over the years, the herd grew and so did the house. Ma liked her space. A smile curved Rose's mouth. I left and married the man of my dreams, and when our parents passed, Howard inherited the ranch. He's since doubled the herd and the family fortune. I moved back after the divorce, but everyone in Colorado knows that Howard is the owner of Iron Mountain. Ever since I can remember, women have been throwing themselves at Howard's feet because of his wealth. He's had 9 proposals in total. Howard scoffed and took a sip of his tea. Molly frowned as she turned back to Rose to hear the rest of the story. Every woman who has ever paid any interest in Howard was only interested in his wealth. I could see that Howard wanted someone who loved him as a person rather than the name and the wealth associated with it. We thought up a plan to find him a mail-order bride. The plan was to surprise her when she arrived, but then we realized we wouldn't know if she truly loved Howard or was just pretending to because of his wealth. So you moved into the cabin as a test of my feelings for Howard? Molly asked, a little shocked at the well-thought-through plan. Howard nodded. I know we deceived you, but I couldn't stand the thought of a woman just loving me for my wealth. I know without a doubt that I fell in love with you, regardless of wealth, and I know that the feelings you have for me have nothing to do with the life of luxury I can offer you. Molly shook her head. She loved Howard whether he lived in a cabin or a mansion. She loved him with all her heart. A smile curved her mouth as she glanced around the room. I take it I passed the test? Howard chuckled. With flying colors, Rose laughed. Welcome to Iron Mountain, Molly, your new home. Molly's heart skipped a beat. She felt as if all her dreams had suddenly come true. Not only had God provided, but he had blessed her with a wonderfully humble husband, regardless of his wealth. Well, come on, we need to get you bathed and ready for your wedding, Rose said with a grin as she started for the door. I don't have my clothes here. Molly shook her head. Rose chuckled. The men have gone to collect our things from the cabin. Besides, your husband made sure you had a worthy wedding dress waiting upstairs. A frown creased Molly's brow as she turned to Howard. You bought me a wedding dress, Howard shrugged. A few other things as well. Of course, we can return them if they're not to your taste. Molly's heart fluttered with happiness. After being a pauper for most of her life, she suddenly felt like a princess. Thank you. Epilogue, Christmas Day, 1876. My dearest Mrs. Gardner, I woke up on Christmas morning, my heart filled with joy, knowing that before I joined my husband on this special day, I owed you a letter. If I had to tell you all that has happened since my arrival in Colorado, you'd be reading for most of the day, and I would disappoint my husband by spending the whole day writing. Instead, I will give you a shortened version of the last 2 months. When I arrived in Colorado, I met Howard and his sister, Rose. They are both kind and humble people who welcomed me into their small but homely cabin. Howard showed me his small ranch and promised me that I would never go hungry, but we would also never live in luxury. To have shelter and food was the greatest gift Howard could have ever given me. I spent most of my days cleaning, cooking, and getting to know the man in the letters. He proved himself every bit as kind and wonderful as I imagined he would be. I soon found myself falling in love with him. Howard proposed to me again a week before Christmas, and this time I said yes without a single doubt in my mind that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. He planned a wedding for us on Christmas Eve. Yesterday morning, Christmas Eve, I woke up in the cabin to find Howard's sister missing. After making Howard a hearty breakfast, he admitted to having deceived me all along. I'm sure you can imagine the disappointment I felt, having come all this way. He asked me to ride with him to confess, and I agreed. We drove to the neighboring ranch, Iron Mountain Ranch. The wealthiest man in Colorado owns Iron Mountain, and respect for the owner was evident in the townspeople close by. When Rose opened the door, shock filled my heart before confusion clouded my mind. After showing me through the beautiful and lavishly decorated home, Howard asked me to join him in the parlor. His only deceit had been to pretend to be a poor rancher when he was in fact the owner of Iron Mountain. It seems that he wanted to make sure that the wife he chose was only interested in him and not his riches or wealth. I married Howard last night in a white chapel in Chancers Creek. Instead of a wagon, we rode to the chapel in a beautiful carriage. Most of the townsfolk attended the heartfelt ceremony. We returned to our large house for the wedding celebration. Mrs. Gardner, how I wished you could have been here to witness the love Howard and I have for one another. He is everything I always dreamed of and never thought I could have. The fact that he is wealthy doesn't enter into my feelings for him, although it is comforting to know that I will never have to go to bed hungry or worry about making rent ever again. He gave me the most beautiful woolen coat as a wedding gift, a thoughtful and generous gift. I write this letter because I know that were it not for you, I never would have met Howard or found my happiness. Thank you for taking my fate into your hands when I didn't have the courage to do so myself. Today we are going to celebrate Christmas with gifts and a feast. I hope that next year you will be present at the Christmas feast we plan on hosting for years to come. The cabin in which I lived for my first few weeks in Colorado was used as a hunting cabin in the past. Since it's too far for the workers' accommodation, I spoke to Howard and he heartily agreed. I'd like for you to come to Colorado, Mrs. Gardner. Howard and I would like to offer you the cabin as a home and even a small piece of land to farm if you so choose. Mr. Gardner can work at Iron Mountain in a position that suits both his age and capabilities. And as for you, Howard and I plan to have a large family, and I wish my children to have someone wise and kind to offer them biscuits and advice, just like you gave me for so many years. I know you might think the offer is too generous, but that speaks for Howard's character. I know you have struggled just as I did in New York. Don't let your pride hold you back from making a decision that will change your life for the better. You have friends in Colorado and a home. I'll end this letter as Howard ended his many months ago. I've included train tickets as well as a money order to purchase whatever you need for the journey. The cabin is furnished, and you only need to bring your clothes. I'll be waiting for you at the station in Denver on the 10th of January, 1877, and can't wait to see you there. I wish I could write more, but I hear Howard calling my name. It's time to open our gifts, and I can't wait to see his expression when he sees the handkerchief I sewed for him before I knew of his wealth. Your friend, Molly Gray Grover.